Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Casey Tygrett to the show. Casey is an author and spiritual director living in the Chicago area. He oversees the spiritual direction practice at Soul Care and is the author of 3 books, including The Practice of Remembering and The Gift of Restlessness, which we'll be talking about here shortly. He is also the host of the Restlessness is a Gift podcast. Casey's passion is helping people pursue Jesus' way of spiritual transformation in the midst of everyday circumstances. You can find more information about and resources from Casey on his website, caseytygrett.com, or on social media. His handle is at caseytygrett. All right, welcome to the show, Casey Tygrett. Thanks so much for being here. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, probably a lot of things. Besides doing podcasts and books and all the stuff we've already talked about, I really have a deep passion for people's transformation and growth. And I also, side things like I golf a lot because it's a great way to be in nature. It doesn't mean I'm any good at it. It's just a frequent hobby. And I'm a little bit of an unhealthy level of college football fan for Michigan Wolverines. So those are some other side things that I get into beyond just what we had already talked about. But we were talking about, we have a bit of a shared background tradition. We both are new to a particular church movement. And so I've been in the Methodist church for a while. I grew up faith-wise in a Nazarene church, and then made the transition over into a restoration movement, independent Christian church stream, about 20 years ago or so. Have been somewhat on the fringes of that ever since. So,
So if I can go here already, I'm thinking last year, right? The TCU versus Michigan must have been rough for you. The Disciples branch of the Restoration Movement was very excited about that game, not so much about the next.
No, it was a rough day in my house. It was, there was sackcloth and ashes. There was a lot of mourning, but that's the way it goes. If you make giant defensive mistakes, people will beat you. That's just how it goes. So yeah, it was a bit of mourning, but we've recovered, I think.
Yeah. Well, you shared just a little bit there about your faith journey. Are you willing to share a little bit more, dive in a little bit more, what that looked like in the past, what that looks like today?
Sure. Yeah. My early years of faith really started in a small town. I grew up in southern West Virginia, and we lived in a very small town. And my whole family attended this one church. And so we were the people that took up the first 3 pews. It was me, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and my cousins. And so a lot of my first steps of faith were there, Sunday school lessons and, as much of the liturgy as I would pay attention to. And then my parents actually volunteered to be leaders of the youth group. And I think that was the first time I got to see a more granular view of what it looks like to do the interpersonal work of helping people develop faith. And so it was they were doing this as a thing that they were passionate about. And I was 6-7 years old at the time. So I had all these older brothers and sisters who just looked after me and taught me things, and would wake up some Saturday mornings and there'd be some random teenager sleeping on our couch because they got kicked out. And so it taught me a great deal about compassion in those early years. And then from there, we left that church and went to a Nazarene church. So a bit of a difference in the expression of faith. The Southern Nazarene churches are far more kind of fire and brimstone, a little bit different in their theology and view of things like the end times and preaching. And so from the Stoic organ music to the rolling piano and when the battle's over, we shall wear the crown kind of hymns and things like that. So my faith took a big shift there from more of this thing that we did when we were together to that's when I started to take seriously the idea of a personal faith. Like this has an impact on my own ethics, morality, what I read. But I also have always had this bit of a rebellious streak in me. When it comes to the Enneagram, if your listeners know about that, I identify as a 4. And so I've always had this romantic, independent streak in me. And so any faith tradition I've been a part of, I've always kind of lived on the periphery of it, open to being thoughtful about other postures and other expressions of the Christian faith. And so, but those years in the Nazarene Church were my most formative. And so that's where I grew the most. And so in recent years, I've been going through, and I was writing a bit about this the other day personally, the idea of blessing something and leaving it. That there are these traditions and things that form and shape us that are key, and we wouldn't be who we are with God, self, and others now without them.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, we know that they're not places in which we can continue to live. And so learning how to bless something that was good to us early and then still leave it for another far country that we feel like we've been invited to. And I feel like that's been the work of a lot of the last, 10 to 20 years of my life is how do I examine what has brought me to this point in my faith? And then how do I adopt a critical realism about it to say, yes, there are good things there, and yes, there are some things that need to be dismantled, and then take that forward into what is the divine inviting me to do as a spiritual director, as a pastor, as a writer? How do I express these things? So, and it's still a developing story. So my faith story is, there are still blank pages to the right of where we are today.
Absolutely. If I may ask a question already, I'm curious. I've been thinking about this recently as I shared with you before we started recording. Myself, I grew up Independent Baptist, certainly a different faith tradition than the context I find myself in currently. And certainly, like perhaps you and many, there's a strong bit of disillusionment and disgust with that tradition. I don't know if it's perhaps the wisdom of years or distance that I've become. I don't want to say grateful for the entire thing, but I can certainly appreciate some things. Like you said, you used the word, I don't remember how you framed it, bless.
Yeah, to bless something and then to leave it behind.
Right. And I just wondered, how helpful is that? Something that just comes with wisdom or experience or distance? Because I think for me at least, it's been much healthier. As you say, kind of blessing something. For me, finding some value and recognizing some elements of value, and then saying, "Hey, I'm leaving that behind." Certainly this is kind of lessened culturally, societally speaking, but certainly the evangelical movement was very strong a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, who knows, right? And I wonder, what would you say to folks like that who find themselves, again, as I was, very much disgusted and disillusioned and disappointed with their home tradition, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a wonderful way to talk about it, because even with that phrase, to bless it and then leave it, it feels like an easy mechanism. There's not a time frame on that, nor is there a set of steps. So some things are left behind because they're dangerous and because they're abusive. And so I would not in any way tell someone to bless their experience of whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual abuse in a religious community, to bless unhealthy doctrine that has made them think of themselves or others as anything less than fearfully and wonderfully made, created creatively and beautifully and wonderfully and called beloved. I mean, anything that brings you to that place where you deny those things, I think you don't need to, I'm not asking you to bless that, but part of blessing can say, what did we learn? What are we learning from this? And so, the one principle from, I think, some Buddhism that has helped is the idea that everything is your teacher. And it does not mean that we honor the teacher, but there is a gift that can be given by even the hardest things that we learn. And I hear that in other places too. I actually hear it a little bit in Paul in Romans, where he talks about how we rejoice in our suffering because suffering produces character, and character hope, and hope never disappoints. That isn't an invitation to say suffering is good. That's an invitation to say this can be a teacher. And so I've learned a lot from looking at my faith foundations and the churches that raised me and taught me, and the people and the communities that raised me and taught me, and to look at them with a bit of grace, because some of them were doing the best that they could at the time with the information they had. Some of them had intents that were misaligned and evil. And so what I didn't want to do is sweep those people in with the other folks who were maybe innocently following along, and maybe now have done the same thing I've done. They've critiqued it and moved on. I don't know. So I would say there's not an easy map to it. It's not sanctifying suffering in any way, but simply saying everything that's happened to us has John O'Donohue, the brilliant Irish poet, says, everything that happens to us has the potential to deepen us. And I think that's true. And as a person who operates as a spiritual director, some of what I'm doing is helping people mine the wisdom of their experience to find where God or the divine, whatever term you're comfortable with, where that being, that power, that presence shows up. And what is it offering? What are you being offered from that? And how do you leave behind the people and the practices and all of that, and yet bless it as something that built you for what's happening next? I would say if a person is having this active conversation, definitely it's advisable not to do it by yourself. A spiritual director or a counselor is usually essential for doing that blessing and leaving well. And that's not that's not a commercial because I am a spiritual director. Right. That's more of this is how I've experienced it personally. Yeah. That person who can shepherd you along the blessing and the leaving, because sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah. If I can lean into that question about suffering, I'm curious about that because I've seen, just broadly speaking in the broader culture, I've seen some resistance and pushback around the idea that suffering must be avoided at all costs. I mean, I'm certainly in the frame of thought that, I, like you, would not bless suffering or think that suffering could be redemptive. But it does seem that, I do wonder if culturally of late we've taken too much of a resistance to seeing any, like you said, suffering can be a teacher. Is it dangerous to avoid suffering at all costs kind of thing?
I think there is some nuance in that. I think there is unjust suffering.
Right.
That is suffering we experience at the design of someone or some kind of system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that is handled differently than the suffering that comes to us just by virtue of us being human and being with other people. The suffering of working through a marriage and marital conflicts that are exacerbated by the fact that we're both human and we get in each other's way.
Right.
The suffering that comes in raising a child and watching them go from stage to stage and just realizing slowly over time how you have absolutely zero control over the outcomes.
Yeah.
You have some planning, you have some intention, you have some things that you do in order to shape and build an environment of health and hope. But we are not. The sooner a parent surrenders the outcomes and simply tries to live in each day, I think the better that could be. But there's a suffering to that. There's a suffering to watching your kid move into areas that you know are going to be difficult for them, and they're going to experience suffering there. But also knowing the only way for them to learn how to stay out of it is to experience it, and you just try to provide as much of a safety net. It's like bowling. You take your kid bowling, you put the bumpers down.
Mm-hmm.
You know the ball is going to go wherever it's going to go. You offer the bumpers that you can. And so, I mean, I think there is a move. I think there's a healthy move in our culture to root out and diminish unjust suffering.
Right, right.
But there's also a journey of learning, I call this suffering and I want to avoid it. Can I actually avoid it? Or is this just is my avoiding suffering causing
part of
suffering
life
for others too? In the quest for me to get out of this, am I putting someone else in it? So taking that perspective, coming back to that great commandment of the key thing for all of us in our life, in our spirituality, in our existence, is to love that which is beyond us, to love the divine, and to love ourselves and each other with everything that we have. And so when reducing my suffering adds to the suffering of others, I'm not living within that true, deep, lasting purpose for humanity. And that causes a whole different kind of suffering. And so there is kind of a wheel, kind of a cycle that we can get into. And it seems like the only thing that dismantles it is figuring out, how do I embrace this for what it is and have the uncomfortable love-hate relationship with it until I find the thing that's at the center, which is a lot of how I talk about restlessness, is it's finding that thing at the center of this thing that we don't want to be a part of. And yet we have no choice. We end up there anyway.
Well, that provides a nice transition for me. Thank you. To talk about your book, The Gift of Restlessness. And I think the first question I have to ask is, I don't feel like restlessness. I've read the book. I'm still leery that restlessness is a gift. Maybe talk about what inspired the book and why, without giving perhaps the whole thing away, why you're still on this idea that restlessness is a gift.
Sure. Well, full disclosure, the irony of the title is not lost on me. And the fact is that I don't search out or desire restlessness either. I think in a lot of ways, the book was my attempt to explain. I talk about books and writing, especially, as trying to make sense of something. Usually first for the writer, and then you find resonance with other people as you talk about it. Hey, I'm writing this book on restlessness, and I think it's a gift. And they're like, oh, that sounds really weird, and I don't agree with you. Okay, well, let me tell you about this thing. And then you start talking it out, and they're like, oh, okay, wait a minute, that makes sense. So it was in the first movements of it were me trying to make sense of something that I have dealt with my entire life, which is every 6 weeks, 6 months or so, I just have this sense that everything needs to change. And this feeling of stuckness. And that can be your garden variety, very surface level stuff. Like, I just decide I'm going to grow some facial hair and change up the way I look. And then my wife is like, you you look terrible. You've tried this for so many years and you can't do it. And in a loving way, of course. And so there's that, or changing up a habit. And then you go from there to more deep and existential things like, everything needs to change, and so I need to leave behind my faith, or I need to leave behind my spouse or my job or my whatever. And so I really was trying to make sense of, and I've not had those later, not leaving faith entirely, but leaving forms of faith, but I've not had the desire to leave my spouse or anything like that. But those restless periods can bring us to that place where we just feel like everything needs to change, because what happens is we get to the place where we cannot go back to the way things used to be.
Right.
An event happens, a stage in life happens, whatever it might be. We cannot go back to the way things used to be. And yet we have no idea what it means to go forward. And we have no means to push that. And so we're really stuck in the present tense. And so the gift is, in that moment, everything that we used to use to prop ourselves up and polish our ego, and even the ways that we used God to sort of cover us in those moments, that's stripped away. And the gift is we get to see ourselves very plainly in a naked light. And the gift is we then get to ask the real deep, serious questions of what is going on and what is there in the middle of this present tense that I'm stuck in that might actually be a gift, might be something good. And so it's a teacher. The restlessness is a gift we don't want, a teacher we don't want, and yet there are also things that we desperately need in order to move forward.
So there's a few things that stood out to me in the book I wanted to kind of hear and maybe talk through some more with you. I'm writing a note, a gift and a teacher we don't want on restlessness here. I think you mentioned it here already in our conversation, but talking about unhealthy images of God, this is something that I think I've wrestled with probably my own faith, and I've certainly seen others wrestle with as well. Talk more about that if you can.
Yeah. Well, images of God, I feel like it's helpful sometimes to come down to the granular picture of it, like the basic definition of it. And when we talk about images of God, what we're talking about is the picture that we get in mind that helps us to understand something that we can't understand. And so I'm very much of the opinion that is shared by some of the mystic writers is that if God were completely understandable, if our images, the way we describe God or the divine, were completely accurate 100%, that immediately means that the divine is no longer the divine anymore.
Right.
Because the poet Wendell Berry actually says, he has a poem called the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. He says, praise ignorance, for what man does not know it has not destroyed. And I feel like that has some overlap here. The moment that we completely, totally describe every detail of who God is, we've really destroyed the idea of the divine or God. And so our images are just us getting close. And so metaphors or images for God just get us close, but they also shape how we live and how we respond. And so there are early images of God that help give us boundaries, foundation, but they also have a limitation to them. So I think of things like God as warrior. And in certain ways, God as warrior is a very safe feeling metaphor that God will fight our battles for us. And there are certain, worship songs in culture that have that built into it, that, God is warrior, God fights our battles for us, etc. But then we start thinking about violence. We start thinking about war. We start thinking about Jesus and how he lived the opposite of that. And suddenly the question is, how far does that metaphor really go? And can I live by it? And if I live by God as warrior, then do I then become a warrior myself and start expressing that in some unhealthy ways? And so then the time comes when that image that once gave us life and hope suddenly then falls apart and it no longer works in the way that it used to. And so that's what I mean by the changing of the images of God. The one that I work with the most, and especially when I was working with students, is the idea of God as Father. That's a repeated image, and it has some beauty to it, especially in early stages of faith and sometimes in the middle, later stages of faith. But for a person who had a terrible earthly father, there's a disconnect there.
Right.
And especially when you start talking about things, and I don't want to go too theology nerd here, but when you start talking about God as Father, and then you start talking about the theories of the atonement, suddenly you have God as my dad and God wants to kill me.
Yeah.
But thankfully, Jesus almost becomes, I heard the writer William Paul Young speak on this. He said, at that point, Jesus almost becomes the mom who's standing between the child and the enraged, abusive father. Well, there comes a moment where you cannot live with that image anymore.
Right.
And so what I find in the restlessness is we are convicted that we have to leave this image of God behind. We can't live with it anymore. And yet sometimes we build the entire content of our faith on that particular image.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is we've mistaken the telescope for the stars. It was never about whether or not God was Father. It was about that's our way of engaging with God, self, and others in the world. And there are other ways to do that. There are other creative ways to do that. And they usually end up feeling really uncomfortable. So when in the book, I use the title The Divine more often than I do just the word God.
Right.
Some people feel really uncomfortable about that. Like it feels too airy-fairy or whatever. But the name God has some connections to it. It's even that name is a translation that we use to describe a reality that we can't really describe fully. And so the divine feels like a term that makes more sense right now, or, God is healer, or God is, you can just stack up all of the images. Restlessness usually happens when we feel like we're getting ready to release, or we're being invited to release an image of God and move into a new one. And I find that most people they're not wrestling with leaving the image behind. Really at the core, they're not wrestling with that. It's that there's this whole group of people who are connected to that image. There's a community of people that a person thinks, if I show up and I don't say God, but say the divine, are they still going to be my people?
Right.
Am I still going to have community? Or are they going to be like, you're one of those wishy-washy whatever people, and slowly move them out of the circle? And so we're way more afraid of losing our community than our ideas.
Absolutely.
So,
I think what makes it hard, from my perspective at least, is that in some faith communities, that metaphor has been lifted up to the point where, the metaphor isn't recognized as such. The metaphor is everything. And then when it is questioning the metaphor, it's as if you're questioning the whole shebang. Thinking about deconstruction, broadly speaking. But I'm intrigued by that kind of your signpost, if I can use that metaphor, of, that restlessness is a sign of something seeking to change or growth or shift within, the person of faith.
Yeah. Well, restlessness, I think too often deconstruction gets described as people leaving the faith.
Right.
Capital F.
Right.
And I don't see that being the case. What I see it being is people leaving a form of faith, lowercase f.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't care about their faith don't deconstruct it.
Absolutely.
They either stop practicing it or they continue to practice it and just double down on the stuff that makes sense. Yep. And so you either get agnostics, an agnostic posture, or an atheistic posture, or you get Pharisees. Right. And I think that's where we're living right now, is within this tension. And I think there are times if we truly, for people who, let me put it this way, for people that I've walked with in deconstruction periods, there are seasons of agnosticism.
Yeah. 100%.
There are seasons of even maybe atheism. Like, I just don't, if this is the image, I cannot believe in God anymore.
Right.
And I don't know that God exists. But I think seeing them as seasons, and knowing that we all are on this, we're all these evolving spiritual beings. Like, we're always changing, always. We're constantly changing. And to know that belief, unbelief, indifference is part of that whole cycle, especially for people who are listening to this, who are pastors or spiritual leaders of communities. People are going around a spiral.
Yeah.
And they are moving from strong foundational belief to questioning to reassessing. It's constantly happening. And so our job is to try and help put the bumpers down and give them some space in which to do that.
I think that's helpful just to hear as a clergy person myself, because I've certainly recognized in my own quote unquote ministry career, there's some times where I'm like, well, I don't know about this. And then of late, I feel like I'm super gung-ho spiritual. And I'm like, what is going on here? So that's helpful to be reminded. I'm also, you're kind of bringing up memories of my own quote unquote deconstruction, reconstruction period. And I remember, for me, this was for me, growing up independent Baptist, where we were very much like, we didn't believe even everyone in our churches or Bible colleges were saved, right? And I just kind of remember doing the math, being like, 90% of the world's going to hell. And I was just like, I probably shared this before, but for me, it's just like, I can't believe in that kind of God. Like, speaking of a metaphor, or not so much a metaphor, but, a concept, right, of God. So yeah, in that moment, in that time period, I became agnostic in a way. I never went quite to atheist where I was like, does not exist, but I certainly was like, I don't know if God exists. And certainly, maybe let's shift it in this direction for clergy, especially right now, who have just wrestled with COVID. I don't know about you, Casey, but I feel like in these last few months, I kind of like have moments where I think back about how rough it actually was going through COVID, and I'm really shook. And when I think about how hard it was on my family, how hard it was in ministry, and I know for many pastors, I'm sure who dealt with things even more challenging than I had to do, are wrestling with a bit of perhaps agnosticism or atheism, literally or metaphorically on their own. What do you say to those folks? I mean, maybe that's not the right question, but what's your thoughts for someone who finds themselves in that position?
Yeah. Yeah, the book, The Gift of Restlessness, actually very much looks different because there was a version of the book that I had written in 2019 and nothing came of it. And so I put it away for a while. And then as we were in the middle of pandemic lockdowns and shifts, I brought it back out, not only because there were some bigger universal themes of restlessness, but also there were some smaller particular themes in my own life, in the lives of other people that I was witnessing. And so very much the book is born, and I didn't write it. It's not a quote unquote pandemic book, but nothing that we talk about from 2020 on is going to be
right.
Free of that right. implication. So I think first and foremost, there's a permission giving that we have to undergo as clergy, and just give ourselves permission to go, yeah, that was as bad as we think. Put the debates about science and vaccinations and maybe even politics, because our political system was racing our fears of global pandemic, and just give ourselves permission to say this was what we thought it was. But also to know that there are things that were born in us, ideas we had, thoughts that occurred to us in the middle of those lockdowns, in the middle of those pandemic discussions, that are vital to us moving forward. So the organization I work with, called Soul Care, we tend to the soul health of leaders of churches and parachurches and non-for-profits. And we did a bit of a conversational, like a listening tour of different organization leaders and pastors. And we came away with a few things that people had realized during pandemic. One of them was there's just a ruthless refusal to go back to the way things used to be. So friends of mine who were at very high-paced ministry jobs got locked down with their family, and they sort of looked around and they were like, these people are awesome. And I never see them. I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so you have people transitioning, taking pay cuts. And I get that this is super privileged, what I'm about to say.
Right.
But they're taking pay cuts, taking lesser roles so that they can have a more balanced presence with their family or with their friends. There's a deeper call for things like formation, spiritual practices, things that ground us. We realized, I think, how ungrounded we were.
Yeah.
How little silence, solitude played in our lives. And then there's a holistic piece. And the only way, for me, the way that it came out is one of the things my wife and I did during pandemic was we started doing yoga. And it was so incredibly helpful. But it also showed me how even still, as a person who knows this is the case, how disconnected my body was from my spiritual life. And so giving ourselves the permission to know, yeah, this was as bad. This period of time was as bad as we think, but also to know that we received some insights. We received some insights that that were valuable to us. Let's not let go of those. And let's courageously pursue them, because it's going to be really, really easy. And it has been. And I've watched it. It's been really, really easy just to go back to, we're finally back to normal, as if that was ever normal.
Right.
We had a different sense of what normal really was. And I think it's time for us to regain that. And that may bring about a bit of restlessness. We can't go back to the way things were in 2019, but we also know that we have no idea how to put these new insights into practice. So here we are in between. We can't go home, but we can't stay here. So what do we do now?
Yeah, I imagine working in the independent Christian tradition, you're probably familiar with Steve Cuss, who's also in that tradition. He's kind of we're sort of neighbors here across the city. Something he talks about in his work is, as a former hospital chaplain, saying that, when someone came into the hospital, those same kind of family dynamics that existed, 10 hours ago before the heart attack or the sudden stroke or whatever, they're bringing those dynamics into the hospital with them. I myself worked as a hospital chaplain, interestingly enough, during COVID. So I saw some of those dynamics in play.
Wow.
But as I think about kind of my ministry during COVID, and I think about like some of those unhealthy dynamics that were present within my own life and how those were kind of amplified. Like for me, a realization I had that I've started to just implement is like, I don't make enough money to support my family, especially in the Denver metro, economy, and that kind of my quote unquote sacrifices for ministry, like I've been bearing the brunt and my family's been bearing the brunt. So it was really interesting to kind of see that, reflect. I imagine you've probably seen that, like you alluded to. What are some other examples come to mind for clergy or for pastors?
Yeah, the one that comes immediately to mind is during these lockdowns, we built ways for people to be a part of our community without being physically present.
Mm-hmm.
And so some kind of online, either a Facebook Live kind of thing, or maybe if a church with different resources has a digital space, an online church. And that had all been happening, as a side project of a lot of churches that I know, larger churches that I know. They've been developing like online campuses, and some of them had the resources to have an online campus pastor or whatever. What happened with pandemic is the people who attend our communities, some of them, we gave them the permission to say, you can be a part of this without ever being here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that changes the metric, I think, for a lot of folks as to what is success. Numerical success.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still something we can depend on? And it also says, when I see someone show up in person to our community, I know they want to be there because they don't have to. Mm-hmm. They could eat French toast in their pajamas and watch pre-recorded or streamed worship and a sermon and call it church. And really and truthfully, the difference is the chair they're sitting in for a lot of people. If they're not involved in some other way, it's just the seat that you're in and the distance you drove to get there. So when people do show up, they are making a statement about, this is my commitment to our community, but also to know that commitment level the commitment level's changed. I was listening to an interview someone was giving about, I forget who it was. I always want to cite where I can, but someone was talking to someone who ran a concert venue.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, every show that we sell out, so we sell every ticket in the house, we usually have between 79 and 80% of those people who actually show up. And so I think there's a commitment change in people since pandemic.
Yeah.
And so and I think this has always been the case, but I think it's just been amplified. I think we as clergy just need to hold loosely the idea of attendance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just hold it loosely and let it be something that we notice, but not something that keeps us up at night. And I realize that is connected in a lot of clergy communities to people who show up are giving, and giving drives other things, and especially like we were talking about livelihood. So there's an implication there, but that has all changed. Charitable giving has changed tremendously, and I think there's a generational piece to that, as well as a post-pandemic piece to that. And so again, we can't go back to times when charitable giving was more dependable, but we have no idea what it means to go forward. So we're in this restless moment. And one of the big questions that I ask in the book is the idea of, do I have enough?
Mm-hmm.
Is there enough? And enough can apply to finances. It can apply to success, can apply to all sorts of different relationships, all sorts of different things. But that's the question. If we hold loosely the idea of attendance and finances, then the question we have to ask ourselves in that restless moment is there enough? And what do I believe enough? How would I define that word?
Yeah.
And I think it's contextual. I think it's for each person to take into a prayerful conversation and say, what is enough? When do I know? How do I know?
Yeah. Well, this conversation has kind of been all over the map, so I appreciate you.
It sounds about right for me, honestly.
I appreciate you engaging with me, and I hope it's helpful for our listeners. Let me ask you one other question here from the book before we take a break. You had a line in the book about God trusting us and what that means for us. And I, again, growing up independent Baptist, I think there's still this kind of like, speaking of unhealthy image of, I think you use this language in the book of like the rotten worm type of thing. And I remember, I think there's language in a hymn of, for such a worm as I, was it At the Cross, I think?
Yep.
I'm really going deep in my hymnology there.
That's a B-side. You're bringing that stuff back for me.
But I mean, that really stirred something within me. Share more about what you mean with that.
Yeah. Typically, that conversation happens in the context of talking with people about what they're called to do, what they sense is their calling or their purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And typically that comes out when we're talking about decisions. And I get the sense that a person is hesitant about making a decision because they feel like they're going to go against what God has for them, or what's good. And the decision is never between like, should I rob a liquor store or should I be a social worker? Like, it's never that dynamic, because that's easy, right? Yeah. It's between two things that really are kind of central to who the person is. There are things that fall within that great invitation to love God, self, and others with everything we have. They're things that are well grounded in redemptive, recreative work. And so my thought is, growing up in a church that was very much about, you're called to one thing, and if you find that calling, you win the gold medal. You can do other things. God will still love you.
But you only get like a bronze.
Yes. And so I've had to deconstruct that a bit over the years. And the one thing that has helped me with that is really thinking about the doctrine of humanity. And I know that the idea that humans are, original sin and total depravity, those things are there to try and explain evil. Mm-hmm. They're also there to try and move a system of salvation along. I don't hold to those anymore. Those are images that I have found unhelpful. And also they seem deeply contrary to how God created humanity in the beginning, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are called very good, and that is never redacted. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm talking to someone who's like, what is my purpose? What should I do? I usually ask them, do you trust God? And this feels like a setup, and spiritual directors are supposed to do a setup. Right. So I'm kind of like, I probably shouldn't do this, but I do. lead with that because that's, for a lot of people of faith, that's a question like, oh, yeah, so I trust God because God is in control. And then when the question becomes, does God trust you? It's bringing them back to the idea that you have within you these gifts, abilities, and desires, and they have been given to you. And so you now have this stewardship of this experience, education, training, suffering that has been transformed into character and character that's become hope. You have all of these things. Do you believe God trusts you to exercise those things? And I'm usually that brings them to kind of a restless moment because they're like, I can't go back and unhear that question. But I have no idea what that means to apply it. And I think a lot of times it means you actually have a choice. You are participating with God. And there's language of that in the New Testament, talking about the co-laborers with Christ. Like we're side by side. We're in this thing together. And God has entrusted you with a life and a family. Dallas Willard used to he'd talk about purpose as the work God has left for you to do in the world, which I think is tremendous, but wow, like what a level of trust. Like I left this unfinished so that you could be a part of it. You could partner with me to see it done. And so that's where that question comes from. And I have to ask so everything that's in there, I have to ask myself that on a regular basis. Like, I don't know what I should do here. Well, do you trust God? Yeah, I do. How I've been made. Okay, does God trust you with this? If I say yes, then I have a perspective now that I can act on. And that changes us, that shapes us, that forms us to actually take that seriously and then act on it.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. Let's take a quick break. The book is The Gift of Restlessness, a spirituality for unsettled seasons. Certainly, we've all been through one, and it kind of makes me want to read the book again. Let's take a quick break, though, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Casey Tygrett, and I always tell folks you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. So if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do with that day?
Oh, if I'm Pope for the day, I really want to spend time with people. That's looking at Pope Francis. I think I would do what he does. I mean, there's just in not everything. I mean, there's some places that I don't know what's going on, but I sense in him this desire to be with real people. I would want to dismantle as much of that like distance as there seems to be, and really reconnect with people.
Yeah. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh gosh. It's a bit of a tie for me. Henry Nouwen would probably be one person that I would want to spend some time with. And also Saint Bridget, the Celtic tradition. I think that'd be a great conversation. I'd love to sit down and have a pint with her.
Awesome. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Oh my. I think on one hand, history will remember that there was a group of people trying to do the best with the information they had at the time. And I think history will also see that instead of working together, we decided to take up sides. And my hope is there will be some sort of great reconnection that has yet to happen, or that may happen after we're gone. But I think history will say there were some people trying to do the best they could with what they knew at the time, but there were also this great movement where we chose sides and we went to battle more fervently maybe than ever with each other.
What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
My hope is that pastors and clergy and leaders will really take seriously the fact that spiritual formation is the gospel. It is the good news. It's not the second half of it. The idea that you might be transformed into the image and likeness of Jesus in the everyday life you live. I think my hope is that the church will recover that. And my hope is that we will be pushed to recover it by unsustainable circumstances. We talked before we came on about declines in different traditions. A great report by Ryan Burge, who's a tremendous researcher.
Yeah.
To me, it all is rooted in the fact, because it's both on progressive and conservative sides.
Yep.
To me, the great hope is that we will realize that a lot of that is happening because we're not offering the compelling story of transformation.
Yeah.
And that we'll recover that. That's my great hope.
Yeah. Well, good stuff. I wanted to ask you a couple more questions, but don't want to keep you in here any longer. Where can people find out more about you and connect with your work?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I'm so grateful that you had me in this conversation and asked tremendous questions and invited me to talk. My best place to find things from me will be my website, caseytygrett.com. Anyone interested in working with, if you're a clergy leader and you're looking for soul care resources, soulcare.com would be another place you can find some of the things that I do. And then I'm on social media, not Twitter so much anymore, but Facebook and Instagram at Casey Tygrett is the best way to find me. So happy to have a chat there too.
Awesome. Well, always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.